we are at a point, so if you're familiar with the work of Martin Revalli and Branko and Milanovic, they're all based on this kind of data. They were all my colleagues. Branko was on one side of my office, Martin was on the other. But what struck me then and strikes me now, data has moved way beyond what surveys can tell us. Yeah. It's not that surveys are unimportant, they're terribly important. But why do we do surveys? We do surveys because we cannot do censuses, right? And so we need to understand from you heard the earlier session with your sampling and try to get a snapshot of what's going on. Professor B. M. Dandekar was at Gokhale Institute and he developed the whole idea of the Indian poverty line, which then led Martin to develop the dollar a day idea of the poverty line, right? But we need to start questioning, not dismissing that, but asking if it is enough, right? Particularly given the nature of data now, which is, if you've read somebody called Zuboff, who writes about surveillance capitalism, everything is data. And it's largely being used to manipulate us into buying this or the other thing. Right? And also used by governments all around the world to manipulate us and nudge us. And the whole idea of nudging, what is nudging? That means somebody is smarter than you and is telling you how to behave because they think they know how to fix your life better than you do. That's nudging. So essentially, data has become a tool in the act of manipulation, and part of that, and so that's one part of it. The second part is, of course, AI and artificial intelligence and NLP and machine learning and all these things have changed what we can do with data, right? If that data was public, and a lot of it is, by the way, Shamika, Ravi was saying earlier that admin data is available on most Indian state government and websites. All of this can now be analyzed by us to track all kinds of things. I'll be talking later this evening about what we're doing to understand local governments by looking at public data. Yeah. Similarly, I think we can, one of the things that I've been trying to do is to ask, why do we have to depend on quantitative surveys to understand how people are doing? This idea of $1 a day, the Dandekar-Sukhatme debates, what all of you must be familiar with all of that. Those debates were wonderful debates. I still have the EBW articles that they talked about from 1982 in my office. I have all of that. I'm a great believer and a great admirer of those debates. But think of what a survey does. It's an artificial conversation. I'm coming to your house. Think of the NHFS, for instance. Coming to your house and literally asking you, if you're a man, did you beat your wife last month? And that's one of the questions. I'm not kidding. Yeah. Or, how much did you spend last week on vegetables? Standard question. Yeah. This is an artificial. If you went to one of your friends, think of somebody you meet in the street. First question, did you beat your wife last week? It's an odd way of collecting information. What is the more natural way is to have a conversation over a cup of tea? Right? So what I'm going to argue, what I've been trying to argue is, let's not go away from that. We need to track what happened over time. We need to have access to those data. We need to have, obviously, access to the census. But why can't we just have conversations with people? In the old days, those conversations were so difficult to analyze that we could only do it with limited samples. Or qualitative research, as it was called. They had to do 100 households, or it was a big qualitative sample. I have just completed, during COVID, I completed a study with 4,000 households in Bangladesh, having half-an-hour conversations on well-being and half-an-hour conversations on their aspirations for their kids. And I'm analyzing it, or me and my team are analyzing it, using natural language processing methods that are borrowing tools from sociologies. We're doing standard old-fashioned qualitative coding, but then scaling it up. So the idea of that these cannot be done with representative samples is wrong. Similarly, there's so much public information now on all our lives. Why don't we look at that to understand things like well-being? Look, see how things are moving. Yeah? So, in this changing, it's both the nature of data, the nature of how we analyze data, the nature of the analytics available as to understand data, is a very central part of where we need to be thinking in the future, even currently, moving away from what the Gokhale Institute pioneered. I wrote a paper, by the way, Gokhale Institute data from this village you've been studying in Satara since 1942. I have a paper on that village, so I'm not trying to deny all of that, but I'm saying let's think forward, let's think ahead. That's one thing. The second point was made earlier today. Why should data be? I'll be talking again this evening. Why should data be only for PhDs to analyze? Why can't your mothers and fathers, your grandparents, your colleagues, your friends who are not in economics departments look at data and analyze it? We can visualize the data, present it in such a way that if somebody can invent an iPhone with a beautifully simple interface, I'm not a computer scientist or computer engineer, I know what happens at the back, but we all use iPhones. Why can't we do the same to data? I'll be talking about that again this evening, about attempts to do that, right? So we need to completely change how data is used, what data is, how we analyze it, its accessibility, and make data part of our everyday conversations, rather than something that is just presented in a paper and forgotten.
You had asked us to start with more of a personal journey, and I will do this very sort of parallel sort of discussion. I should say, but I did my PhD at UCLA, and when I got started at UCLA, I didn't think I was going to do any work with data. But there was a course that was required, this is some years ago, so instead of it being data science, it was a general statistics course. But the final project is what got me really excited and got me into public policy and into data. And let me explain what it was. We took just one quarter, 10 weeks of statistics. And what the professor did is the professor gave us let me make it a little anonymous. An Ivy League university in the United States had submitted to the US government statistics about the number of minorities that they had hired. And they also had a method that the government accepted as the method to do that evaluation. And they just gave us all the numbers and they gave us the method and said, figure this out. How many minorities would this Ivy League university have to hire in order for it to be found not to be in violation of the law? It turned out if you did, and it was a lot of math, because that was the intent, and you figured it out, as long as this Ivy League university hired 2 minorities anywhere in the university, they could not be found to have any discrimination at the school. And it realized the power in a public policy setting that if you set the rules of how to use data, you can very well say a lot about what the answers are going to be in the end. And I got really excited about this. I did a lot more in statistics in terms of my work. And when I got to the Hertie School, I should say I'm a professor of public policy right now, I had some administrative roles where I participated with others. Slava Yankin, which was very important. Our former president, Henrik Enderlein, was far more important than I was. But thinking about what we do with data science and public policy. And what we do is we tie together and we say, okay, there are a lot of policy issues where data is critical, but there seem to be off 2 worlds out there. There are people who are excellent data scientists, but have no idea how the policy process works. That little trick I just described to you, for example, where in the process would you put in this plan? How is this set up? This is much more on the policy side. A lot of the policy people have no background at all in what to do with data. I mean, when I mean data, I sometimes mean even calculating means and how that's different than a median. I'm not talking about other things that you can do with data. Very simple things. I have an example there you mentioned in terms of our executive masters of public administration. Some years ago, we had the chief of staff of a minister president, the equivalent of a governor, okay, of a state in Germany. And in terms of looking at statistical data, there are stars next to. You may know that in terms of coefficients, we often think about significance term, how significant is something by the number of stars. And her comment was, why do people put stars on documents like this? Okay, it was very, very simple, basic stuff. And we started something that was basically, we said internally, it was called Statistics for Idiots. Not idiots, it was statistics for people who have no background at all in statistics. And the goal is, if some basic knowledge really can go a long way. What we do at master's level now is we have a series of courses that are both really focused on, for people who don't have any background in statistics, no background in large language models, ChatGPT, and other sorts of things. We have something that's very technical, but there are technical people who come to us who have no background in the policy. And the goal is somehow to work together and build something out. So in terms of the evolution, I should say I'm not one of those core professors. I am somebody, though, who uses this. I do work now in particular where for example, we've pulled every budget speech in 10 countries since World War II and gone through and coded kind of what sorts of signals are sent. It's sort of a communications model. And the latest techniques make it very easy to pull that data and to analyze that data. But we're asking really policy questions with these big data sets. And I think that's also one way that you can kind of take this and do it, not just for me as a professor, but these are things that we do with students as well.
Of how data has been used effectively in public policy. I'm sure that you would have read or might have also used it a lot. But what are 1 or 2 examples that really stand out and tells us about the potential of this?
That's a very good question, actually. We all claim that it has great use, but to think of two stellar examples. I think one example, in some ways, it's a debate with myself, is, to me, the fact that over the last 30 years, we've seen such an enormous decline in poverty around the world, largely because of gains made in India and China. Yeah? I think that has taught us a lot about how public policy has affected poverty. For instance, the link between NREGA and the reduction in poverty rates in India. I think that's been well established. Yeah. Does trickle down? It comes back to these basic questions of does trickle down really work? Yeah. So that's one big example to me, at least in the Indian case. Let me give you an example of how data was not used properly. Yeah. Which was the Doing Business report that was produced earlier at the World Bank, which was based on a set of questions. Asking different sort of people in key sectors about the struggles they had with doing business. Great idea, right? Important. But when you come up with an indexes are very powerful things. I mean, this is the thing I want you to take with you. You think the Human Development Index, that the UN produces. They're very powerful things. Because in some ways it's a cognitively easy thing to absorb. It's a number you rank order things. But what happens with that is both good and bad. It generates a political conversation, and then people start manipulating it to sort of go up and down the index. Yeah? I think both the Human Development Index and the Doing Business Index that the bank did are victims of that process. The Human Development Index has been massively revised with the World Bank now. There's a whole department run by a friend of mine called Norman Loaiza that's actively revising the whole thing. And the Human Development Index of that the UN produces is also being questioned, right? So one good use and one bad use. So I think we have to be careful. Let me quickly say something on indices. Why do we use indices? Because of a cognitive problem. It's not a data issue. It's that most human beings find it difficult to keep 5 ideas in their head at the same time. You see a bunch of indicators. Let's take 3: literacy, income, and infant mortality, the Human Development Index. Why should we take the weighted average of those three things and come up with a number? What sense does that make? These are 3 entirely unrelated things. We can have all kinds of debates about what weight to put on what and all this kind of stuff. Why not just visualize the darn thing in a simple way so you can then look at those visualizations? Those of you in data visualization know that's a relatively easy thing to do. If it's about human cognition, you can look at pictures and keep those complicated ideas in your head. Why do you have to reduce it to an index that's so misleading? That's just a thought. Thinking of the power of indices, let's get away from that. I think you young people should be thinking about ways of getting away from indices and allowing human beings to look at multidimensionality in a way that is cognitively possible to process.
Great. I'm going to answer also with both pluses and minuses in the same sort of way, I think. But I'm going to actually ask you a question and see what your hands might be, because this will tell you something. One way the data has been used quite recently is if you think about your brains, okay? You might have an illness in your brain, and the question is, can that quote-unquote be treated, okay? And you can do a scan, and you can look at the scan, and you can make a call. Do I treat, or do I just say, sorry, you've got 6 months, but there's nothing I can do. We shouldn't invest in this anymore. One way you could think about data is you could train a model to look at 30 or 50,000 different scans, and then to look at the scan and then say, okay, this person should be treated, this person shouldn't be treated, or if the advice would be this, let's put it this way, not make it so material. Another way is to think, I've got a doctor who spent 30 years looking at these scans, treating patients, right? And I should have the doctor make the determination whether or not we continue with the treatment. How many of you, please raise your hands, how many of you would trust the AI to make the diagnosis? That seems, let's say, 50,000 scans. 2 of you, 3 of you, okay, that maybe 4. I take it, how many of you would trust the doctor? Look at that. Really, really interesting, right? So that's one of the questions of how useful would this sort of data be. I should say I did something similar in the US. And interestingly enough, in the US, there's a lot more trust in the model. lots of worries about doctors and how predictable are doctors and things like this. I do it in Germany, and I'm not even sure I'd have 4 who would trust the model. I think it's actually basically 0, right? And if anything, if you signal in Germany, you had a computer or AI take a look at these scans, and they informed the doctor. That may also even be questionable. Why are you using this outside tool? I mention that because, and this gets to, I think, another level of thinking about data. Data can be remarkably useful. I gave you somebody who's looked at scans for 30 years. What if it's the person who's looking for the first time versus the 50,000 in terms of the AI? Your answer might change a little bit based on how trustworthy you think the doctor is. But nonetheless, there are certain issues that may differ across different settings, different countries. There are ethical issues, and what do you do with the data when you collect it? Where did I get those 50,000 scans? How is that data then used later? Is it used by insurance companies or somebody else later to say, you had a scan, and look what was in that scan? So there are a lot of ethical questions that arise in terms of data as well. So my answer was to say, I see the potential of doing all sorts of great things, but a bit like the comment about indices and what you do with the data once you get it, I think that's really where a lot of the exciting things are being done today.
Now, specifically for you, Vijayendra, India has been doing a lot in the past few years in terms of digitization, right? And therefore, you often hear about, let's say, UPI, the financial inclusion, the bank accounts that have been opened for everyone. Now, with those, of course, there is a potential for them to be used in poverty alleviation as well. Mm-hmm. One is, what is the potential? What is it that is there? Because you also have all sorts of stuff, let's say, the movement of goods across highways, right? And you have a lot more of that coming in. What is the potential there for it to be used in poverty alleviation? And have you seen that potential being realized over the last few years?
I mean, look, I don't think we can avoid a world where all of us are being tracked all the time. We're already in that world, partly.
Yeah.
So to somehow pretend that we don't live in that world and we want to go back to 1942 when the Gokhale Institute was pioneering its methods here is a little silly. Yeah. We're now in a world where we're all being tracked all the time. Every country is moving towards UPI, Aadhaar, or whatever different countries use. The US has the social security system. But I think in order to use, I mean, Jean-Dres and Ritika Khair have written a lot about this, looking only at Jharkhand, so that worries me a bit, because that's one state. But we have a lot of examples from Jharkhand where there are type 1 and type 2 errors. I mean, people are being misidentified as poor, and poor people are not being identified. Okay? So you have both those types of errors for a variety of reasons that they document quite well. I'm not sure the same is true in my home state of Karnataka, for instance. Right? So I think it would be good to get more states, more data from states about how these are being used. But those critiques should not lead to a situation where we are arguing that UPI should be thrown out. It should lead to reform. How do we make it better? How do we make it work better? Yeah. And I think we can. So it will start, I mean, it'll take us 10 years, 20 years for the system to work in such a way that we can identify everybody's status in a particular way and try to sort of do something about it. My concern with all of this, with data-based identification of poverty, I mean, it's not just UPI, it's also everything else. Yeah? Any sort of proxy means testing. You guys know what proxy means testing is, right? Everybody? Where you're using, I mean, think of BPL, below poverty line, they do a survey and they give you a cutoff and say, below that you're poor, above that you're not poor. Any system like that is going to have problems of inclusion and exclusion, okay? By definition, because of these sorts of reasons. Yeah? So it's not like BPL was better. NREG, I remember, is self-selection, because it's 100 days guaranteed employment. If you're poor, you'll take it. So in some ways, that solves that problem. It's not like the other targeting programs. Here's the solution that I think India can do and used to do, and that's thrown away. And I've been studying Gram Sabhas, village meetings in panchayats for a very long time. Back in the early 2000s, when you had that BPL list come out, of these are the people who are deserving of certain programs, that list, those names would be taken to a public meeting in the village. And people would then say, why is, Mr. Raju there? He's got 5 acres of land. And why isn't, Mrs. Kumari there? She's a widow and she's destitute. So they would then question that. So in other words, the idea of using local knowledge to correct these proxy means targeting systems is the way to go. Not everything can be done with data. The human element has to come in. And that's an easy fix. We have Gram Sabhas all over the country all the time. It's mandated in the constitution. Urban areas, we don't have them. That's a whole different problem we'll talk about this evening. But in rural areas, we do. Why don't we just use that? Take it to the Gram Sabha, particularly things like housing allocation. Enormous corruption in how that happens. We all know it. So let the list be vetted. Yeah? So I think bringing in the human element, thinking about how to make or humanizing this, what I'm calling reflexive policy making, is, I think, a limitation. Yeah? But otherwise, the potential is huge.
And Mark, for you, you have seen academia across, I think, 3 continents, is it? So both America, China, and Europe.
Yes.
So, yeah, so Asia, Europe, and Africa. So with this, then, how is academia changing to account for this role of data, right, into public policy making? Given that public policy itself is an interdisciplinary field, how do you see and how are institutions, and specifically the Hertie School also, how is it evolving?
I was thinking of the panel this morning in terms of how much does this get into policy making itself, and that's a different question, and you could probably answer that much better than I could. Then, to what extent is it spreading in different universities? I mean, I do see a policy school is inherently interdisciplinary. That's something I'll talk about, in fact, on the panel I'm on tomorrow. And so it's a fertile place to think about bringing in different types of disciplines in one place and really pushing data science. It's not just us. Georgetown is doing a lot on this. NYU is doing a lot on this. UCSD, there are others. I'm mentioning the American schools in particular. It's slower in Germany. In Germany, it's much more traditional in terms of how the system works at traditional universities. It's much more discipline focused. So there are some really interesting data science work that's being done, for example, at the Technical University of Munich, Technische Uni München, in the south. It's a technical university. They recently formed a policy school as well, but nonetheless, they're very technical and kind of, there's always the question of application. Where do you see the application? And so I think you see it less there. You alluded to China. I only spent a semester in China kind of as a scholar in residence. And what I found there was just a lot of curiosity and interest in applying different methods. But I found it a bit more bottom up, to be honest. I mean, especially among the students. There were some interest in terms of the professors, but some things that were offered were rather rigid. And again, I think the excitement came more from people who are already doing a lot of interesting data work. And this, by China, what humbled me, and it humbles me here as well, is how much potential data there is. Okay, just teaching a seminar and I had students bring in their own data sets. And the sort of things that were available, sometimes there's a little concern how the data was collected. There are all sorts of sampling problems, et cetera, et cetera. But there's just, there is something about scale that you don't see in some other places that is quite interesting. So you asked about universities. There is some change. And again, I think it varies by different places, and we can describe why maybe the incentives are for it to change more in some places rather than others. But in the policy world, in a place like Germany, they talk a lot about data. They put a lot of money aside for data. There was this thing that happened this last year. I think it was 233 million euros they put aside. And then they said, oh, well, next year we're not going to spend anything on this. It's one of the budget cuts. And they said, why? It's because they only spent 1 million of the 233 on data projects. The money's not getting out the door. There were other sorts of problems, things like this. They did some other things. The other thing is there are other categories where they had some data stuff. It's not like they did zero. But there's sometimes reluctance to do different things. There's a question of what should they really be doing? Or are they just catching the latest thing? So I hope that was useful.
So before we move on to the Q&A from students, what is one piece of advice that you would offer to them? Given that I think a lot of them would be in their early 20s.
How many of you are getting degrees in economics or some related field? Everybody.
Great.
Okay. So 2 pieces of advice to the potential economists here. A, learn Python. Learn how to program or learn R. Get out of this data SAS habit. Yeah? Because you'll be looking at data in a very different way than we did. I was trained in SAS. I was first trained in Fortran actually. But then in SAS and then in Stata. I was one of the early users of Stata at University of Chicago. So this is all old stuff. Yeah? You've got to learn how to see data as something very different than my generation did. That's point one. So please think about machine learning, think about AI, think about LLMs with all their limitations. Everything is data. Yeah? And when everything is data, I got teams now working on mapping. I got all kinds of stuff going. And by the way, they're all much smarter than me. Yeah. So they teach me stuff. And that's where you guys need to be. Yeah. Everything is data. Second, a good economist is not just an economist. Read widely in every discipline out there. If you just read what economists write, you're searching under the light. Yeah. Particularly, please, and I beg you, let me just make something clear. I'm not speaking for the World Bank, I'm speaking for myself. Yeah? So just to be clear, most of my colleagues will disagree with me. Please don't get influenced by whoever wins the Nobel Prize in economics. Okay? Because that itself is another game. And it causes all kinds of misery. People commit suicide because they don't win it. I mean, it's a silly, silly, silly game. Economics should never have had a Nobel Prize. It's not physics, it's not chemistry. It's a social science, for God's sakes. Yeah? Economists are social scientists. You're nothing more than social scientists. Hopefully good ones, but you're social scientists. So what does that mean? You've got to read what the political sciences are doing, what the anthropologists are doing, what sociologists, what the psychologists are doing. You've got to incorporate all of that in how you think. Yeah? And the definition of economics has changed. It's no longer the Robbins definition of scarce resources and all that, right? Economics is the science of studying human behavior. So is sociology, so is psychology, so is political science. Maybe with slightly different emphases. So all these social science disciplines are going to become one. And they're all going to be dominated by techniques that are currently techniques in mathematics and computer science and increasingly coming into these fields. So that's where you guys are going to be 20 years from now. Yeah? So I would encourage you to think ahead to that way.
Well, it's hard to follow that act. I very much I agree with basically everything that you said. I think what I would simply add, and I'm going to go back again to what you have said in some of your previous comments, is the best, I would even say economists really are those that know the methods but are also critical of what it is that they're doing and constantly looking to get better. And what I mean by that is the idea of you can crunch this index, but you think about what does it really stand for? What am I really trying to measure? I often get a sense that the people who don't do data think that data has the greatest potential because they haven't really gotten their feet wet, so to speak. They haven't worked with it. Having said that, people who then simply dismiss it and haven't worked with it, I think are the polar opposite and are also a problem. I think it's really you get into it and you say, okay, this is a tool. There are other tools there as well. Can I gather other sorts of tools? Can I apply this in something that I care about? And so I'll add one more thing. Not only should you be well read, but you should care about what you do. If you have passion for your work, if you have passion for what you want to do, other things you can kind of push your way through and solve it. If you do it only because, take this example of R. If you want to learn R because you want to answer questions that you care about, you'll be much better than somebody who just has to learn R because it happens to be in some class. So think about what it is that you do and try to integrate that. And I should say, I'm kind of in between. I learned Stata, and that's SAS. The way, as a professor, I try to get into R's. I try to teach it myself. In fact, I even taught it in China. And I've got stories on that if you have time. But that, in terms of, I agree in terms of kind of, what's great about it is it's more bottom up. You have lots of users who are writing different sorts of things.
So yes, now let's open the floor for questions from the audience.
Hello sir, my name is Meher Saxena and I'm a PGPIP student here at Gokhale Institute. So my question is for Vijayendra sir. So how can we reduce the bias which may be caused by the friction between the qualitative data sets and the quantitative data sets which we use in our studies? So I was reading about your research and I found that because sometimes qualitative data sets may not be able to grasp at the quantitative aspects of certain surveys, and the quantitative may not be able to grasp the qualitative nitty-gritties or the gray area responses. So how do we account for that?
First, let's get out of this habit, which you don't have, but many people have, of thinking that economists are smarter than everybody else. We are not. Or that quantitative is better than qualitative. It is not. There are different ways of looking at the world, that's all. Yeah? If you take that perspective, internalize it, then everything becomes very clear. I mean, let's go back to Gokhale Institute. Think of what Dandekar did in 1942. I forget the name of the village, the Satara district. And I don't know if Gokhale Institute still studies it. If you don't, please go back and study it. That's the longest village panel we have in India. Yeah? Going back to 40. In fact, 26 some British people had surveyed it before that also. So it's 1926, not 2026, just coming up. Almost 100 years. What did he do and his team do? They did a lot of field work. They talked to people. They wrote about that. It's all documented in some Gokhale Institute library, I'm sure you can go take a look. Then they developed the survey instrument. On the basis of the qualitative information, I'm not advocating anything that our gurus didn't do 100 years before us. Yeah? You go back and look at the work of a fellow called Charles Booth in England in the late 19th century. It's exactly this. Fantastic work. A. So let qualitative work inform the quantitative to generalize from the quantitative. Secondly, you're doing an evaluation. When you do an evaluation, you must have read a lot of RCTs. If somebody's teaching you, can you raise if you know what an RCT is, evaluations? Not that much. Okay, basically all these techniques to understand whether something had a causal impact or not in a policy intervention. Most of these papers will tell you this was the impact. It had a 10% impact, 5% impact, the placebo said this said this. If they want to tell you what happened to make that impact happen, you'll see some mathematical modeling. Why not just ask people? Just talk to people, no? What happened? This project came in. How did it change your lives? What happened? In fact, track it qualitatively. It's madness because you're somehow superior if you don't know what would like to talk to people. Okay? Second. Third is what I was talking about earlier. There is no reason for qualitative information to any longer be non-representative. You can do a census with qualitative data. In fact, you go and look at Twitter, you go and look at, somebody did an understanding of how do we measure well-being looking at Wikipedia pages. That's a little mad. But anyway, everything is data. Yeah? So as I said, we are now developing techniques to do open-ended interviews with representative samples, with large samples. And we're inventing techniques to understand. Others have invented, we are also inventing, other people will continue to invent. Data has changed. There should be no distinction between qualitative and quantitative. It depends on the question you want to answer. So long as you get it out of your heads, that somehow because your GRE score is higher or because you got better scores in mathematics, you're somehow smarter than other people. You'll be fine.
Yes, sir. My name's Arya. I'm doing my bachelor's in economics. I had a question regarding your using local governance and local knowledge in order to humanize data. A lot of local data, especially in India, which is at the village level, is missing. So, and also these people lack the knowledge in order to use data efficiently, because for us, using data is still a major learning curve. So just imagine people at local governance levels, like sarpanches, who have no idea what data is. So how are you going to tackle that if you want to humanize data at a local level?
Come at 6 o'clock, I'll tell you. Think of somebody in your family, somebody you love, who's not a data scientist, not an economist. Are they smarter than you? Are they dumber than you? Okay. They're as smart as you are. If you can look at data, they can look at data. Okay? The only thing you have is a little bit more training. But if you can take that training and make the data available to them in a way that they can understand, then everything is fine. I mean, everybody looks at data all the time, by the way. When you're looking at YouTube, you're deciding what video to watch, or Instagram, or whatever, how many followers do I have? That's data. Yeah? So everything is data now, which means that there is no reason for anybody who's above the age or below the age of 50, above the age of 50, forget about us, yeah? Below the age of 50, to understand data and how to use it. You just have to make it possible. So our work has to be, as more technically trained people, to make it possible for whoever it is to appreciate the data and understand it from their perspective. Dashboards, visualizations, mapping, lots of things. We're looking at Google Maps. How long will it take me to get to the airport? I mean, that's a simple thing, you think, but you see how much work Google had to do to get you to that point, right? That's our work. We have to be the Googles.
Hello, my name is Isha, and my question is specifically to Vijayendra sir again. So you said that you should use conversations as a measure of gathering data instead of surveys, and I agree. Or
I didn't say. I never said instead. In addition to.
Okay. Yeah. So I agree that conversations will provide more authentic data and will be a better representation of what is happening probably. But what about the cost and time considerations that are associated with conversation instead of surveys? Because surveys are, you have directed questions, so you get data in a particular span of time, and you might not be able to get the data that you are asking through implicit questions in a conversation. So what about that?
Thank you, Isha. Another good question, though I must correct you. I never said instead of, I said addition to. Also, I'm never going to argue that surveys are these give better data or not. They help you answer different questions. Everything has to be complementary. I'm not rejecting anything. I'm including things, always. Yeah? Okay. With that clarification, your question is a good one. What about the cost of both data collection and analysis? Let me give you an example from my own work. Yeah? I studied Gram Sabhas for a long time. And I did a book called Rural Democracy, looking at 300 Gram Sabhas in South India. We recorded those Gram Sabhas. I had teams taking tape recorders to Gram Sabhas all over South India in 2002. We then transcribed everything into English. And then me and Swaramita Sanya, my co-author, sat and analyzed that for 10 years. Not because we looked at it all the time for 10 years, but she had 2 babies, many things happened to me, we didn't have time. But it took us 10 years to write the book. Finally, 2018, the book came out. Data collected in 2002 and 2004, okay? Because we were doing it by hand. 2014, I collect data from 100 Gram Sabhas in Tamil Nadu in, 2014 in November. By 2017, I have a paper in the American Political Science Review analyzing that data. That means the whole thing has happened, it's been published. Because I used natural language processing methods. And I used machine learning to do the translations from Tamil to English. Machine learning and with human corrections. Yeah. So everything is going to be much easier now. Particularly as you grow up, those tools are going to be easy. That's what I'm saying, learn Python. These are all Python. Yeah. There is no reason for those costs to be prohibitive. And what I found in collecting data, I did 3,000 interviews, not 4,000 in Bangladesh over COVID. These were phone interviews. The cost of the quantitative survey was exactly the same. It was no difference. You have to pick a different set of people. The thing is, enumerators, census enumerators or survey enumerators are a different breed. Their job is to make sure you give an answer. They'll sit and whatever. And the old man is sitting there, how much rice did you buy in the last week? I don't know, ask my wife. No, please give me an answer. My wife will come, she's gone to the market. No, please give me an answer. He'll give you an answer, he'll write it down. That looks like, so how do you know whether that data is correct or not? Just because it appears like a number doesn't mean it's correct. There's a whole science of correcting it and all of that. So data quality remains the same, both good and bad, whether you're doing open-ended or structured. This is what quantitative question is. So but you don't want that type of enumerator who's poking you all the time to give the answer to do qualitative interviews. Because they're horrible. Yeah? They're machines. You want somebody, your best friend who you take all your troubles to and listens to you very carefully. That's the person you want. Who's good at it. There are other friends you won't go to. There's some friends who go to very good at listening. Because maybe your mother and father, or your father is very like this, he won't listen, but your mother will listen to you. The grandmothers are always like that. That's the kind of person you want. Yeah? Those are good qualitative people who can ask the right questions, who will listen and respond. Yeah? That's what you want. But the cost is going to get narrower and narrower. The gap is going to get narrower and narrower and narrower.
My name is Gunjan. I have done my master's in economics. So in public policy, mostly data we collect is through surveys or primary surveys. So the major challenge which it faces that the people who are surveyed feels like they are being questioned and they sometimes provide the wrong information. So what is your way to tackle such problems?
Well, let me make a comment on this. Om is here in the front. He's a co-author of a project we just finished in September. So I'm going to talk briefly about that to get to yours, which is where we look at, indeed, Indian opinions of the World Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and we compare the two. And the question was, how are we going to do this? Would we do this with an internet survey, online panel, which is something that's quite common and used for different things? Would we do it in person? If we did it in person, where would it be? What would be the advantages and disadvantages? And what we ended up deciding was we did it in person in 4 different cities. Intentionally, we chose different cities in different parts of the country. We tried to sample certain types of people, like certain people with education, people who are illiterate, other sorts of people, to try to get kind of varied backgrounds. And not all that fell together as we wanted. And there are advantages and disadvantages of doing that as opposed to another type of samples, where I'm going with this. And I think in terms of how you get people to do this and the shortness, this goes back to your point, which is you train people before they go in the field and you talk about what sorts of things to ask. But at some point you are going to lose some people because different methods, I think also going back to what you said, have different strengths. And sometimes what you want to do is combine different types of data ultimately.
All good quantitative data collectors have a bit of the qualitative in them. All good ones. Yeah. And I go back to Professor B.M. Dandekar. Read what he wrote. Or go back to so many, Pranab Bardhan, about all the great Indian economists, V.K. R.V. Rao, M.N. Srinivas, sociologists, with the exception of Hallerberg. He never wrote about this. But in Indian economics, it's always been the tradition to do an enormous amount of pre-work before you go off and do your final survey data collection. Pre-testing. And training is an important part of it. Yeah? We've forgotten that skill. The NSS has long forgotten that skill. The NSS didn't come out of magic. The initial NSS survey was done, that's not an obvious, of course, was done with a lot of pre-testing. Yeah? So that's how you improve the accuracy. Nothing is going to be perfect, but you improve the accuracy. Yeah? Constant iteration, testing, then you reach a point that ये चलेगा अभी काम करते हैं इसको stop करते हैं यहाँ से शुरू करते हैं. That's you're going to reach that point. Yeah? Most of the econometrics that you study, you must have studied instrumental variables or whatever, you might have, are because of imperfect data. All of causal inference is because of a problem called missing data. Because you can't see the counterfactuals, you have to find ways of inventing the counterfactual, right? A lot of measurement error, correction of measurement error, using instrumental variables and other things. These are all techniques because of imperfect data. So the better the data is, the easier you will have easier time doing econometrics. Yeah? All of these apply to qualitative data as well. There's no difference. You need to do a lot of pre-testing to get that protocol done right, so that at scale, in a small scale it's different. You're doing 10 households, that's different. You can spend 2 months, 3 months studying that's different. A lot of sociologists do that, that's not the same thing. But when we're doing it for representative samples, because of the scale problem, you have to get those questions right, the techniques right, and hire and train the right kind of people to do it. And of course, supervision. All of that. I mean, those are well-known things. I'm not saying anything that many people in this room don't know. But they cannot be ignored.
Hi, my name is Partha, and I'm doing my bachelor's in economics. I wanted to ask that in your experience, in the recent, maybe in the last decade or so, has there been a large differential in the bureaucracy associated with implementing, innovative solutions and new policies, like in the world? And is there a difference between the outcomes? For example, countries that are more open to such solutions, have the development outcomes been better as compared to countries which are more traditional and they want to go with the solutions that have worked well for the past few years and such?
You should take this.
Well, but
this is your field.
the thing is, you talked about causality. The causality story is very complex for what you were arguing. I mean, I do like to contrast different systems. If I think, for example, in the UK, whenever a new government comes in, and it's been a while, the Tories have been there now since 2010, but you get this shift where lots of things are just thrown out the window, right? And it looks like that they're active reformers and they're really open, as you say, but you get a lot of reversals. And sort of a question here is how much of it is driven by the political calendar and how much is it driven by actual policy outcomes that you want to see? Of course, there's a whole field in economics, and we offer a lot of this looking at policy evaluation. Right? What is it that you're measuring? What's your theory of change? What are you trying to achieve? Can you isolate this? Now, of course, it can lead to some RCTs that get to be too constricted, and when you look at it, you're not quite sure what, you may be so focused with getting something that's quote unquote significant, but it's practically worthless, to be rather blunt, or it doesn't travel, it works well in one very narrow context, but it doesn't work someplace else, and we have to ask bigger questions about why that's the case. So I think you were asking sort of more what I would call systemic questions. There's some places do better than other places. And I often find these things are just so incredibly complex. I think it's one thing that is good about the emphasis on causal inference these days is how do we unpack that? Can we get down to something that we really can look at, measure, and get some sort of sense of what's there? And even with your background in economics, I mean, that's, again, a lot of the best economists are going in and doing a lot of some really interesting work with an applied policy focus.
Bureaucrats are interested in or believe that they are smarter than everybody else and they should be doing things, not all bureaucrats. I'm making that. And a lot of what I say for dramatic effect. Huh? So there are a lot of caveats to everything I'm saying, but I'm trying to make it interesting, so I'm saying it like this. I'm talking to the camera also in case future people hear me. Right? So, but bureaucrats generally don't like decentralization. They don't like giving power downwards. They like to control from the top. And they are great partners to all the app builders and all the developers and all the IT people because they believe the same thing. Yeah. So what's happened in India and other countries is that match is a match made in heaven. Yeah. It's a great marriage, but not necessarily good for the rest of us. Yeah. Because that process centralizes power. Yeah. So for instance, in Missouri, where of course all the IAS officers go to get trained, IPS officers, there used to be regular courses in Panchayati Raj. I understand from my friend Raghunandan who used to teach in those courses that those courses have been stopped. Now they teach courses about RCTs and IAB, apps of this and developments of that and Aadhaar and all. They're all important. I'm not dismissing any of that. But the idea that citizens have control is slowly disappearing. I think that's a massive mistake. Massive mistake. Okay? Because I'll show you today, comparing who does better in governance, politicians or bureaucrats. I've done a study on the natural experiment in Karnataka. At the end, democracy works better, not bureaucracy. Yeah? Bureaucrats have to report to politicians. That does work better. That doesn't mean that politicians don't have problems. All the, what I call 3 C's, capture, corruption, and clientelism. Those are central problems of politics. Yeah? So that combination of bureaucrat and politician working together is important. That's what a democracy is. Yeah? When you think that you are trained and you are smarter and hence you can fix everybody's problems, I'm reading this wonderful book which I recommend everybody, Patrick Olivier's biography of Ashoka, Emperor Ashoka, which he has done by looking at all the Ashoka edicts, not by looking at some histories of what some Buddhist person wrote, but really what the data tell us about Ashoka. One thing is very clear, it's all about this. It's about empathy, it's about what he calls dharma, which is really about ahimsa in the big sense of the word. Gandhiji got a lot from that. Yeah? When we take those perspectives, for the whole point of view of the Gita essentially, all our texts are about this. How do we get people, empower them so that we collectively become better off? We cannot do that by acting as individuals. We have to act as collectives. Which means we have to listen, we have to learn, we have to work with people who may not be as lucky as us to have ended up in Gokhale school to get a master's in economics. Okay? That's the lesson I think I wish bureaucrats would learn. So to me, that's the scary part. Thanks.
All right, on that note, we'll call a close to the session. So thank you both of you. Thank you, Vijayendra. Thank you for thanks to the audience as well, both for being here and for your questions as well. And I think both of you would be here for a few minutes in case the students want to interact.
Sure.
Yeah. So this is one of the opportunities which we thought you guys could take advantage of. Both of them will be here. Please do interact with them. Please do put them with questions.
We don't bite.
So yeah, with them we'll call a close to the session. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.